Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with the third episode on Plato's Gorgias. In the previous episodes, we saw that this is a dialogue between Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, and a man named Gorgias. Gorgias was a rhetorician in the ancient world who taught rhetoric and practiced rhetoric. And he was giving a display of rhetoric in Athens, but Socrates was late for dinner. He missed the show. And it turns out that Socrates actually wasn't so interested in hearing Gorgias speak like everyone else was. Rather, Socrates wanted to question Gorgias, and he wanted to find out, what is the power of this thing that you call rhetoric? What do you do with this? What is the purpose of it? So Socrates begins to question Gorgias. We also see that his students are hanging around and they're eager to step in, especially Polus. Callicles is another one of his students, and this is at his house. So what happens in the initial phases that we discussed is that Gorgias thinks it'll be easy to answer this question. Rhetoric is probably the most powerful thing that there is, because through rhetoric, you can persuade anyone of anything and get anything that you want out of them. But as Socrates, looks at that and tries to understand what is this all about, he probes Gorgias on a few things. One of the key things is, well, what do you persuade people about exactly? And he gives examples, and the examples are based on arts or things where we actually know something, and we can persuade people based on our knowledge of that subject. And one of the things that this exposes, and that Gorgias is actually quite ready to admit, is that in order to persuade people with rhetoric, you don't need to know anything, or you don't need to know at least the complete truth about what you're talking about. You simply have to know how to persuade, not how to actually teach or instruct, which is a distinction between opinion and knowledge. You can get people to have a certain opinion without yourself having to even know what the truth is, whether it's a true opinion or not. So one thing we see about rhetoric is that you can use it for any purpose, and it can sort of, it's almost parasitical on any other art. So for example, Gorgias says his brother's a doctor. He says, my brother may know what's the right medicine for you, but sometimes he has a hard time convincing his patients to take the medicine. But I don't know what medicine they need, but I can persuade them to take the medicine, right? So that's one thing about it. The other thing, though, is that's arguing that rhetoric is about anything. But he also at one point says rhetoric is particularly about justice or injustice. And this is a significant thing because it points to the power of rhetoric, which he's arguing for. And that's because through arguments about justice or injustice, you could persuade people in the courts, and therefore you can get the law to function for your benefit. You can get a judgment for or against anyone that you want, and that's a very significant form of power within the political system, obviously. But this raises a question, and Socrates only hints at this question originally. But Gorgias, at a certain point, becomes defensive. And as I've mentioned before, we want to look for the dramatic details in the dialogue, because Plato is a playwright at heart, and he is dramatizing things. He's not simply just giving us a treatise here. So when we see Gorgias starts to defend himself against an accusation that Socrates didn't even make, but Socrates was certainly hinting at it, which is, how can you argue about justice on the basis of opinion rather than knowledge? In other words, aren't you misleading people about justice? You're going to the courtroom and you're getting a verdict on the wrong side, potentially on the wrong side of this case through rhetoric, right? So rhetoric is, but the way that Gorgias is framing it, there is a high risk of injustice, deceitfulness, and harm that it can cause to others. That's the most obvious thing, is how it can harm others. Although we're going to see today that Socrates is actually not necessarily concerned simply with how it affects other people, but his more fundamental concern is, how does it even affect you if this is what you're doing? you're going in and basically, deceiving people as a professional at a professional level. How does that affect you as a human being? And so Gorgias, in his self-defense, he says, look, if somebody teaches wrestling and then somebody goes and trains with them and goes and uses the wrestling techniques to hurt people, that's not the trainer's fault. He never trained them to use it or abuse it in that way. So he wants to present it like, hey, it's not his job to worry about how people are going to use the rhetoric. He's just going to teach them that. We've already seen, however, that that's not it's not a very sincere argument, because Gorgias has already sold his art, or what he considers an art of rhetoric, as being powerful and as enabling you to persuade others without having to know what you're talking about. So it's not as if this is just an arbitrary use that somebody could put rhetoric to. This is how he's selling it. He's selling it as, you're not going to need to bother worrying about what's just or unjust. You're just going to be able to convince people what's just or unjust. Okay, so the next phase that we're going to go to, this is where Socrates is he's going to push into these contradictions in what Gorgias is saying. He's going to cut through the baloney, really, and he's going to expose Gorgias for who he really is. And as he does this, Gorgias is going to mainly retire from the discussion, and it's going to be taken over by his students, because they are more willing than Gorgias to actually own up to the reality of what is going on with the art of rhetoric as Gorgias practices and teaches it. So as we start here today, Socrates is going to probe into the gap between knowledge and opinion when it comes to rhetoric. Every time the rhetorician is more persuasive than the doctor, he says, the one without knowledge will be more persuasive among people without knowledge. So he's pointing out, you couldn't do this to people who knew. You can't fool doctors with rhetoric about medicine, right? You could fool people who are not doctors with rhetoric about medicine. And he asks Gorgias to confirm, and Gorgias says, in this case anyway, that does follow. So you can see that Gorgias is not comfortable with where this is going. But he's like, yeah, I guess you're right. If it's about medicine, then yeah, you couldn't do that on people who knew medicine. You'd only be able to do it on people who don't know the difference. And Socrates says, but the rhetorician is in the same condition with respect to all the other arts too. So it's not just this case, Gorgias. That follows from your entire account of rhetoric, is you never know what you're talking about, and therefore you'll never be able to convince anybody who knows the subject. There's no need at all for it to know how things stand with the subjects themselves. It just needs to have discovered some contrivance of persuasion to make it appear to those who don't know that it knows more than those who do know. So what are the things you see from this formulation? You're making it seem that you know, and you're making people who don't know think that you know more than people who do know. So in other words, every single time you are deceiving people. Even if you happen to get it right, the broken clock is right twice a day, right? So you might actually be persuading them of something that is true, but you don't know that, and they don't know that. And the person who does know it, you're running circles around them, right? So you're making it seem like you know what you don't actually know. So it's always deceptive. It's never truthful to do what Gorgias is doing and what he's teaching other people to do. And how does Gorgias respond to this exposure that he is being systematically dishonest? He says, well, doesn't that make it a lot easier, Socrates, for someone who hasn't learned the rest of the arts, but just this one, to be no worse off than the artisans? It's like, hey, that's a selling point. You don't have to learn medicine. You don't have to learn, anything. You can just learn rhetoric, and then you don't need to know anything else. But we've already seen that he himself identified the most important topic of rhetoric as being justice. So if we apply this to justice, it means that for him it's a selling point that you are deceiving people about justice, and you don't have to bother knowing what justice is all about. So he had already tried to defend himself from the accusation, the implicit accusation that he is committing some kind of injustice. And here we can see where this is going, is that he's not going to be able to defend himself from that, because that's the nature of what he's doing. He's deceiving people about justice, which could hardly be described as a just way of treating people. And this is, of course, where Socrates goes next. Is the rhetorician in exactly the same condition with respect to the just and the unjust, the shameful and the beautiful, the good and the bad, as he is with respect to the healthy and other matters belonging to the other arts? Now, one thing I want to note here in passing is that Socrates is, you see how he's lining up justice, injustice, good, bad, beautiful, ugly. He's lining those up with health and unhealth. Okay, that's going to be a really, really important theme in this dialogue. For Socrates, why do we want to be just? What is justice really all about? We could see Gorgias doesn't really give a hoot about justice, and that's going to become more and more obvious. But why should he? Why should he care if he's being just or not? Well, why would we care about being healthy or unhealthy? Right? I mean, you could ask that question. What's the big deal if I'm healthy or not? Well, health is what we could consider an intrinsic good. We don't have to ask that question. Why be healthy? Right? It is good in itself. We don't seek health for some other reason because, if I'm healthy, then I can get, more money or something like that. No, we spend money to get health, because health is an intrinsic good. It's something that's good in itself, not instrumentally for some other purpose. And that's exactly what Socrates is going to argue about justice and beauty and truth and these things, that they're intrinsically good. And so what we're losing if we don't have them is something that is good in itself, something that if we understood, then we would never want to lose it. But he's only just setting that up here with these parallels. So his point is that the rhetorician doesn't know these things. He doesn't know what's good or bad, what's beautiful or what's shameful, what's just or unjust, but he contrives persuasion about them, so that without knowing, he seems among those who don't know to know more than the one who does know. So he's being deceptive about all of this. Now, we could already see how this is going to be bad, not only for the audience. They could be deceived about what's just. They could be deceived about what's healthy. They could be deceived about what is beautiful. They could be deceived about what is good. But beyond this, what about the person who's doing this deception? Because you notice that Gorgias had said you don't have to bother learning these things. So why would you say, why would you want as a human being to say, I don't want to bother knowing what is healthy. I don't want to bother knowing what is good. I don't want to bother knowing what is right or wrong. Do you really want to live your life without even knowing what these things are? Because that's where this is going as well, is if you're going to focus on how to manipulate people and so on and so forth, you're systematically ignoring the question of what is actually good, which means that even in your own life, how do you know that you're seeking what's good in your life? This is where Socrates' question, what is the power of rhetoric? This is where it's going to go is, yeah, sure, you can manipulate people and get what you want, but so what? What does that get you? Does it get you a good life? How would you even know if you don't even know what a good life is? If you have ignored that question to the point where you have no idea if you're living a good life. So this is where he's going. But here he says, how does it go with things like that, Gorgias? And as I mentioned, another dramatic detail, when people swear, Socrates brings in Zeus. He says, and in front of Zeus, make the revelation you were just now saying you would, and tell us what in the world the power of rhetoric is. So this is a signal that Socrates is getting serious now. He's giving Gorgias a lot of opportunities, to try to rescue himself from the trap that he's headed for. And Socrates is kind of hinting at this point, this is going to get serious. If you can't come up with a better answer than this, he's exposing. He used the term revelation. That's maybe a polite way to suggest that he's about to expose Gorgias as a man of injustice. And so Gorgias is going to make at least one more attempt here to try to wiggle out. He says, well, I suppose, Socrates, if my student doesn't happen to know what's just or what's good or these things, even though that's not part of rhetoric per se, because he's already defined rhetoric in a way where you can ignore that per se if you're doing rhetoric. But he'll say, but if my students don't know what's just, I'll teach him. He'll learn them too from me. I'll just throw it in for free, right? It'll be a bonus thing. I'll teach justice along with rhetoric. Don't worry, Socrates. Sort of like patting him on the head, or at least trying to deflect this and say, hey, let's change the subject. And let me just promise you that if my students were unjust, I would correct them. And even though rhetoric per se doesn't have anything to say about this. But Socrates doesn't let him get away with it. He says, hold it right there, because you're putting it beautifully. If you make someone a rhetorician, it's a necessity for him to know the things that are just and unjust, either beforehand or afterward, by learning them from you. And Gorgias says, quite so. So Gorgias, we're going to see that this isn't going to work for him. He's making, first of all, this is not sincere, which we'll find out. He doesn't really care about teaching justice, but he's now committed himself to saying that justice is necessary, even though it's not part of the art of rhetoric. It is somehow necessary to avoid, injustice. That's on the premise that justice is good and injustice is bad, which, as we'll see, he doesn't really believe. So he's really doing this just to sort of cover himself from exposure. He doesn't want to publicly admit to not caring about justice, and therefore this isn't going to hold water. But it is going to accentuate the question of justice, which is, well, if Gorgias doesn't really care about justice, why does Socrates care so much about it? And that will be the central question of this dialogue as it emerges. So Socrates, pushes on this, which, as noted, isn't going to hold, but says that it's a necessity that the rhetorician is just, and that a just person wants to do just things. Gorgias says, so it appears. You can see that he's not really happy to be focusing on this question. He's not enthusiastic about this. Therefore, the just person will never want to do injustice, necessarily, Gorgias says, and from our speech, it's a necessity that the rhetorician is just. Yes. Therefore, the rhetorician will never want to do injustice. It appears not, anyway. So what Socrates has done here is he said, wait a minute, you were saying previously that you don't need to know what's just to do rhetoric, but now, to sort of cover your rear end, you're basically saying, well, of course you have to be just to be a rhetorician. But doesn't that mean, if you really believe that, then justice has to be part of rhetoric? It would have to be part of the art, right? If you admit that you cannot separate these things, that it would be wrong to separate them, then why did you separate them before, right? So this is an uncomfortable line of questioning for Gorgias, because he doesn't really have a good answer for that. And Socrates calls attention to the discrepancy. He says, so in view of that, when you said those things then, I assume that rhetoric, which always makes speeches about justice, could never be an unjust thing. But since you were saying a little later that the rhetorician might also use his rhetoric unjustly, I got so surprised, thinking the things that had been said weren't in harmony. So he's pointing out a contradiction in the things that Gorgias had said, a lack of harmony. And again, I want to stop and note the word harmony. As we will find out in this dialogue, this is another thing. It's like, health. Health is a primary analogy to help us understand justice. Why do we want to be just? Well, again, why do we want to be healthy? Right? Justice is a kind of health. And similarly with harmony, if we're listening to music, for example, and we hear notes that are harmonious, it brings pleasure to us. What happens if we hear notes that are disharmonious? It's painful, right? So if you say, well, why do you want harmony in music? Again, it's an intrinsic thing. It's intrinsically good. and we perceive it to be good, whereas disharmony is intrinsically bad, and we perceive it that way. So this will be another key analogy for understanding justice. Justice is a kind of health. Justice is a kind of harmony. And the flip side of that is when Socrates finds people are contradicting themselves, and he says, you're not in harmony with yourself. This is an indication that there is something wrong, right? Why is it bad to contradict myself? Just think about that. Hypothetically, if I contradict myself and somebody points it out, I could just laugh and say, well, so what? I don't care about if I contradict myself or not. But that's not how people react, right? People say, what do you mean I'm contradicting myself? They don't want to admit it. Or if they're more open-minded, they would say, maybe I need to think harder, right? Maybe I need to learn something, because they don't want to contradict themselves. They want to settle it, resolve it. So this is an indication of how Socrates is going to build his argument. Why do we care about what's true and good and beautiful and just? We care about them in the same way that we care about health or harmony or these things, because we could perceive that there is a goodness in it. And the flip side of that is contradiction, disharmony, sickness. These things metaphorically pertain to self-contradiction and injustice. So at this point, we could see that Gorgias is he's fading, right? He's not, as Paulus is going to point out just now. Gorgias might have a response to what Socrates is saying, but he's not willing to tell the truth. He's not willing to actually say what he thinks in public. So therefore, he can't really answer Socrates. And Paulus is going to volunteer to help him out and say, okay, I'll be willing to go on the record and say what we're really doing here, Socrates. And so let's take a look at what Paulus says. What gives, Socrates? Do you really think about rhetoric the way you're now talking about it? So part of what he's implying is, do you really care about justice, Socrates? He doesn't find that credible because, as we're going to see, he doesn't care about justice, or he doesn't think he cares about it, and he doesn't think Gorgias cares about it, and he doesn't think that Callicles cares about it. So why would Socrates care about it? He uses a term, uncouth, at one point. He says, the way you're talking is uncouth. It's not, smart people don't really care about these things. Or do you imagine because Gorgias was ashamed not to grant you that the rhetorically skilled man knows the things that are just and beautiful and good? Just what you love when you yourself were leading him on with such questions. So this is important. He says, Gorgias was ashamed not to grant you that the rhetorically skilled man knows the things that are just and beautiful and good. So what does that mean? He said he was ashamed not to grant this, but why was that important? He wouldn't say it because he was ashamed to say it, but the truth is, he implies, the truth is that he and Gorgias think that you don't really need to know what is just and beautiful and good. That this is not actually part of rhetoric. That rhetoric, it's not necessary to know those things, because your purpose in doing rhetoric is not to be just or to be good or to be beautiful. Your purpose is to get power. So a couple of things important about this. It certainly shows the motivation of Gorgias' students, and this will become abundantly clear as we go through the dialogue, that Paulus and Callicles are learning rhetoric precisely so they can practice injustice. It's exactly what Machiavelli argues in The Prince, that you need to know how not to be good. You need to know how to use the fox and the lion, and this is the fox part, rhetoric, how to trick people. You need to know that to be able to satisfy your desires, to get what you want. But also, dramatic detail, he says this in front of Gorgias. He says Gorgias was ashamed to say what he really thinks. What he really thinks is, who cares about justice? But he was ashamed to say that. Well, Gorgias is right there, and he could step in and contradict and say, oh, what do you mean, Paulus? No, of course not. But he doesn't do that. So this is very strong evidence that it's exactly what Gorgias thinks. The big difference between Paulus and Gorgias is that Gorgias, being somebody with a reputation to uphold, is not willing to actually say this, whereas Paulus thinks that he could say it and get away with it, and he's not afraid to say it. So for Socrates to get into what's really going on here, he's going to have to switch to talking to Gorgias' students. That's going to be a little more difficult in one sense because they're going to have a harder time following Socrates. But on the other hand, they're more willing to actually come out and say what they presumably all think, but Gorgias was not willing to say. So Socrates says, Paulus, you most beautifully mannered gentleman, if in any respect Gorgias and I have gone out of bounds in our speeches, you stand by and do set us straight. It's just the thing for you to do. And on your say-so, I'm willing to take back whatever you want from among the things that have been agreed, if any of them seem to you not beautiful things to have agreed to. Because, presumably, you claim to know the same things Gorgias does. Isn't that right? I do, says Paulus. So it's not the first time. Paulus has been itching to get in here from the beginning of the dialogue and show that he has learned things from Gorgias. He wants to show off. But we see here again that Socrates is framing this as a kind of discussion that is aimed at truth. He says, if we said anything that was wrong, whatever it was, you point it out and we will take it back and we'll redo that. So there's nothing here about trying to win a debate or trying to pass anything off on people. It's precisely the opposite. Socrates is not trying to persuade people of anything per se. He is trying to find out what's true. And so the dialogue which Socrates effectively, although he has to struggle at times, but he's effectively in control of this dialogue. And even though these people are arguing about an art of rhetoric that's all about manipulating people, but Socrates gets them to go along with a dialogue which is about the pursuit of truth, something that they themselves admittedly don't really care about, but he gets them to go along with it, and that's going to include Paulus, as we'll see. Now, there's a very interesting twist here because Socrates is famous for questioning people, and he's often accused of, when he catches them in contradiction, there must be some kind of trick. And by the way, Socrates, how come you're always questioning people and you're never answering questions, right? He's accused of that quite a bit. But here, Socrates gives Paulus an option. He says, do whichever of these two things you want, ask or answer. And Paulus seizes upon this. He says, I'll do just that. Answer me, Socrates. What do you claim rhetoric is, since Gorgias seems to you to have no clue about it? So he thinks he's doing something, very triumphant here and saying, I'm going to show that, what's going to happen to you, Socrates, when I question you, instead of you always questioning other people. But as we'll see, we will get in this section, we're going to get an outline of what Socrates thinks about this subject. The problem is that it's so radically different from what Paulus thinks and from what Gorgias and Callicles think that they're not really going to know how to respond to it. And so it is going to require Socrates to turn back around and question them and try to walk them through to the point where they could understand it. And that's really the structure of this dialogue. So in this episode, we will be able to get to the point of seeing an outline of Socrates' position, but it's going to be one that they will find incomprehensible, and that is going to take the rest of the dialogue for Socrates to try to go through it in a way that they could understand. So Socrates says, well, are you asking me what sort of art that I claim rhetoric is? And Paulus says, I am. And here Socrates throws him for a little loop. He says, none at all, it seems to me, Paulus, to tell you the truth. So Paulus is a bit surprised. You don't think rhetoric is an art at all. You know, here he is paying a whole bunch of money to learn rhetoric, and he's like, you don't even think this is an art. You know, you not only you not think it's such a great art, but you don't think it even is an art at all. But remember, the art, techne in Greek, refers to a kind of knowledge. And Gorgias had already admitted and even bragged that rhetoric, you could persuade people without knowing the subject that you're talking about. And so he still thinks that it's a kind of knowledge, a knowledge of how to persuade. But as we're going to see, Socrates thinks the lack of knowledge is really what defines rhetoric, and that it's not worthy of being called a techne or an art because it so fundamentally lacks that foundation of knowledge. So Paulus says, what does rhetoric seem to you to be? And Socrates says, a certain kind of experience. Experience at what? At bringing about certain gratification and pleasure. So what they consider to be persuasion, which I think part of what Socrates is implying here is that persuasion in a true sense means that you actually are getting people towards truth. You're getting them to see a truth that they couldn't see before. That would be true persuasion. But what they're calling persuasion is not to actually get somebody to understand something, because you don't understand it yourself. You're not going to help them understand it. Rather, what you're doing is you're gratifying people. You're making them feel good about a certain opinion or a certain point of view to the point where they would adopt it, but not because they understand it, but because you're making it feel good for them to do that. You're making them feel good about it. And we've already seen this in action in the dramatic detail, because when Socrates and Cleitophon come in, they indicate that they would like to experience some beautiful speech. And when Paulus is trying to sell them on rhetoric, he says it's the most beautiful it's the most beautiful way of speaking, basically. So he knew that's what they were interested in, so that's how he sold it. Then Socrates makes a distinction, says, well, I don't want to hear long speeches. I want to have short speeches back and forth. And Gorgias says, Socrates, I'll give you the shortest speeches you've ever heard. I could speak short. Yeah, I can give you the shortest. So you could see that the technique that they're practicing in rhetoric is largely based on telling people what they want to hear. And that is getting people to go along with you, basically. And so you can get what you want out of these people. You tell them what they want to hear, they're going to go along with you, and then you can steer them whatever direction you want to. And Socrates is saying that's not an art. That's not any kind of knowledge. That's just a certain knack or experiential, knack of being able to gratify people. And he's going to expand on that, as we'll see. So Paulus, he tries to spin this in a direction that, you're saying it's a beautiful thing because it's gratifying, right? You notice that his assumption here is that what life is all about, what makes something beautiful and good, is just that it feels good. So it's an art making people feel good about things. Oh, well, that must be beautiful, right? It's nice to feel good. But of course, that's not what Socrates is getting at. It's quite the opposite. He's going to describe it as a very shameful thing. Well, it seems to me, Gorgias, that it's not an artful pursuit at all, but it belongs to a soul that's good at guessing, brave and clever by nature at dealing with people. So it's a kind of cleverness, and it's a kind of bravado and so forth. But the crux of it, he says, I call pandering. So pandering, as we know, pandering could be a crime. Certain forms of it are. Just like fraud, for example, is a crime. But also basically luring people into criminal acts is itself criminal. So Socrates is going to associate rhetoric with things that are anywhere from sort of low on the totem pole, like they're legitimate things, but they're not highly esteemed in society, all the way down to things that are actually considered criminal and shameful in society. It seems to me that there are many other parts of this pursuit as well, and that one of them is cooking tasty food. So this is where Socrates is like, it's not something that's illegal or that's that's immoral per se. Although, as we'll see as we dig into the food thing, Socrates is going to imply that there's something wrong with this attitude towards food, because food is something that should be healthy for us, something that should promote health. And if we simply look at food as a way to stimulate taste buds, then this could be very unhealthy in the long run, right? And he says this, like this art of making tasty food seems to be an art, but the way my speech has it isn't an art, but a matter of experience and repetition. So we're going to dig into that in a little bit, why exactly that's such an important distinction. But we see here that Socrates is going to say, yeah, there's a certain kind of knack that people have, a certain kind of facility people have, but it's a facility with an experience of what brings pleasure. And he does not dignify that with the term knowledge or art. Because as we're going to see, Socrates is going to associate knowledge and art with something that is based on an understanding of the nature or the order of things, which is tied to what is good for things. So for food, for example, as we'll see, a knowledge of food, a knowledge-based approach to food would be knowing what is actually healthy and making food that is healthy. And you would have to know something about, the body and nutrition and things like that. That kind of approach to food would be a knowledgeable and respectable approach, but one in which you're simply thinking, well, what food is going to taste the best, and that's your only standard. I think that is not worthy of the term art or knowledge. But going back, we saw that for Gorgias, the most important thing that rhetoric talks about is justice. It is therefore dealing with law and politics. And so Socrates is going to bring this back around and say, how would this problem of rhetoric not being an art, how would that relate to its role within the political system? Because this is where he's going to be implying and getting into that there is an art of politics. There is an actual knowledge-based approach to politics. Just like for food, you could actually know what is nourishing and what is healthy. In law and government, you can actually know what is beneficial and good, as opposed to just persuading people based on, stimulating their emotions and making them feel like this is good, whether or not it really is. So Socrates says, by my speech, rhetoric is a simulation of a part of politics. So in other words, it's a phony version of something that should be done in a real way within politics. What about it then, Paulus says? Are you saying it's beautiful or shameful? So you notice how Paulus still doesn't even get that this is a slam. This is a slam on rhetoric, because he seems to be so deeply entrenched in the idea that life is all about feeling good. And therefore, he's hitting up against this thing. Like, what is wrong with feeling good, Socrates? What's wrong with that? But of course, Socrates is going to make this increasingly clear what's at stake. It's actually shameful and ugly to be trying to feel good in a way that is going to hurt you in the long run. Right? So shameful, Socrates says, I call it. And I do call bad things shameful. Like, if this is going to hurt you, and you keep doing it, it's shameful, since I'm obliged to answer you as if you already knew what I'm talking about. So here he's pointing out that Paulus is trying to jump to the conclusion over and over again. He's trying to say, is it good or bad? And Socrates is like, I haven't even finished defining it. I haven't even finished describing what it is. So it's premature. But of course, part of that simply shows what we've already seen, that Paulus and Gorgias, they're not practicing the art of knowledge. They're not practicing the art of how to understand things. They're just practicing the art of how to fool people. So this is hard for Paulus to actually try to go through and understand the nature of something. He's not used to doing that. And at this point, another dramatic detail, Gorgias interrupts. He swears, by Zeus, Socrates, I don't understand what you're talking about myself. So this is important because we've already seen that Gorgias was ashamed, and he didn't contradict that. He was ashamed to actually say what he really thought, and he was going to let his students speak for him. But as Socrates is starting to really, expose not just Gorgias's contradiction, which has been exposed, but he's starting to really dig into the thing, that what you're doing with rhetoric, you think you're so clever and you think you're gaining from it, but you're actually hurting yourself with it because you're devoting your life to something that is actually harmful, and you've never even thought about what is beneficial or harmful. You're simulating something that you don't understand, just like you're simulating medicine when you don't understand medicine. You could end up poisoning yourself one day because if you believe your own rhetoric on something. But with politics, which as we'll see, politics is about how to live a good life. That's the Socratic understanding of politics. Since we don't live alone, we live with other people. So the laws and the rules of the community are essential for directing us towards a good life together. But if you don't know what the good life is and you're out there convincing, persuading people, you're not just harming them, you're harming yourself. You're leading yourself astray. You don't know where you're leading the society that you're a part of. And you don't know what you're doing to your own soul. So Gorgias must be catching on that Socrates is not just silly, he's not just naive, it's not that he just doesn't realize what people do with rhetoric, that Socrates actually has a critique of what's going on, and that his critique is based on something. But Gorgias still doesn't see what the critique is all about, but he can see just enough here to think he wants to butt in because he doesn't want to just let it go. He wants to make sure that Socrates is going to clarify this. This is the first sign that Gorgias is becoming interested in Socrates' point of view. That he doesn't just want to blow this off, but actually he's starting to get curious. He's starting to think, I would like to hear what you're talking about. Like, you honestly think that I'm ruining my own life by doing this? Well, why is that? Socrates says it's likely, Gorgias, because I'm not saying anything clear yet, but this Pallas is a headstrong young thing. So Socrates says, yeah, I've got something to say, but I'm having a hard time, because I keep getting interrupted here. Pay no attention to him then, and tell me how you mean that rhetoric is a simulation of a part of politics. So Gorgias, he wants to give Socrates a chance to speak and to articulate his position. Now, again, as I said, he and his students are not really going to get this when Socrates outlines it, but it's going to define what the rest of this dialogue is going to be about, which is that it's going to be the contest between their point of view, by which life is just about feeling good and get what you want, versus Socrates' point of view, where life is about health and harmony and truth. And they're not going to really understand why he thinks that, but they are going to go through the process of arguing back and forth. They're going to try to prove he's wrong, but meanwhile, he's going to try to prove that they're wrong. And we'll see how that goes. For now, though, we get an outline of what Socrates thinks. So this is very important. Let's take a close look at it to wrap up this episode. I say that there are two arts, Socrates says. The one applying to the soul, I call politics. So this is the Socratic definition. We see this in several dialogues. Politics is the art of caring for souls, as the Athenian stranger says in the Laws. So there is the art of that pertains to the soul, which he calls politics. While I'm not able to give you a name that way for the one applying to the body, I say that ministering to the body is one thing with two parts: gymnastic training and doctoring. So he doesn't have a general term for taking care of the body, but he says there are two parts of it. Basically, gymnastic training refers to anything where your goal is to increase health. You're already healthy, but you're trying to perfect your health. You're trying to get stronger, trying to get more agile, whatever different elements of health, you're trying to maximize them. Whereas medicine is you're sick. There is an injury, there is an illness, You're trying to cure that as much as you can, fix it. Okay, so the same thing he's implying could apply to politics. Part of it is you're trying to perfect souls and make people as happy as possible, but part of it is also correcting. You've got injustice, you've got unhappiness, trying to fix that as much as you can. And both those, so they're analogous. We want to take care of our bodies, we want to fix, sickness, cure it, we want to be as healthy as we can. But we also want to take care of our souls, and we want to make our souls as healthy as possible. And if they're sick, we want to cure them. And that's what politics is all about. Okay, in politics, there's lawmaking in the place of gymnastic. So the laws are about here's how we can live the best possible way. And justice, that is legal justice or criminal justice, corresponding to doctoring. So if something's wrong, we're going to have to step in and correct it. The aptitude for pandering, noticing this. So this is where rhetoric comes in. And rhetoric is a form of pandering or flattery, manipulation. Noticing that there are these things, not by discernment, I mean, but by guesswork, dividing itself up 4 ways and slipping into the guise of each of these parts. So a rhetorician can imitate a doctor. He can imitate a gymnastic trainer, but he could also imitate a legislator or imitate a judge. He can pass himself off as knowing something about health of the body or health of the soul. Pass itself off as being that very thing it has slipped away into. It has no concern at all for what's best, but using what's most pleasant in each case, sets up a trap for foolishness and entices it with the result that it seems to be of the highest worth. So what this means is just like for the body, if you want to get healthy, you want to do gymnastic training, you could go to somebody who really understands the body and how it works and can help you to get in your best possible shape. On the other hand, you could go to somebody who's a flatterer, somebody who knows how to make you feel good, knows how to maybe motivate you, but they really don't know what the heck they're doing. They could be making you healthier, or they could be making you worse by having you do some things that are not going to work or even hurt you, right? So which one would you want to go to? The one who makes you feel good, but you might end up getting hurt and you're not really benefiting your health? Or do you want to go to somebody who actually knows what they're talking about is actually going to make you healthier, even though maybe they're not going to flatter you as much and it's not going to feel as good? They're going to say, hey, get your act together, and it's going to be unpleasant. Same thing for a doctor. You could go to a real doctor who can make you better, or you can go to somebody who just talks like they know it and makes you feel like they know what they're talking about, but they're really just tricking you. Same thing for politics. And this is the crucial part, for this course, obviously, in leadership. So you can go to the flatterer in politics who says, here's what the law should be, or here's how we should, decide this case. And they base this on emotions. They base this on trying to make you feel good about this policy or this outcome. But they don't really know if that's beneficial versus the person who actually knows what is good in terms of how to live, how we should act, how we should live. This will actually make us happier if we do this. Or this situation is bad, here's how we can correct it in the best possible way to get the most happiness or minimize the unhappiness of this situation. So it presupposes that there is objective truth about what is good or bad and what makes us happy or not. That it's not just a matter of feelings. And feeling good is not the same as being good. And there's a difference, and somebody with knowledge can tell the difference. They can know if something feels good but it's harmful, or is it, even if it feels bad, it could be healthy, right? So that applies to the body, but also applies to the soul. And Socrates sums it up this way. So cooking tasty food has slipped into the guise of doctoring and passes itself off as knowing the best foods for the body, so that if there had to be a contest between a cook and a doctor, among children, or among men as foolish as children, over which of the two has an understanding of desirable and worthless foods, the doctor or the cook, the doctor would die of starvation. So notice that Socrates, for the sake of argument, he might be exaggerating, but he's admitting Gorgias's earlier point. Maybe it's true that you can convince people to take their medicine better than the doctor could, but since you don't know medicine, that's not a good thing. It's a shameful thing. And what happens, he's saying, is that if there's a contest between people who are recommending the food that is most healthy, and they know because they understand the body and what's good for it, and there's a contest between them and somebody who just knows which food tastes the best, and they have no idea if it's healthy or not, but they can just always, tickle your taste buds. Who's going to win? He says among children, obviously, the junk food salesman is going to be more popular than the health food expert. And he said, even among men who are as foolish as children. So he doesn't come out and say like what percentage of adults are that foolish, but he does imply that in society as a whole, it's often going to be the same way, that the people who are pushing things that are unhealthy, but they feel good at the moment, are going to be popular. Whereas the people who are pushing things that are harmful, things that are actually healthy, but they don't necessarily taste good or feel good always, they're going to be less popular. So I call it pandering, he says, and I claim that sort of thing is shameful, Paulus. Yes, I'm saying this to you. So we can see that even now even Paulus is getting uncomfortable with this discussion. He's wondering, what am I going to do with this, right? I mean, he'll come back. We'll see that he's going to put up a fight. But just like Gorgias tried to slip away, Paulus is starting to squirm here. And Socrates says, yes, I'm talking to you, Paulus, because it makes guesses about what's pleasant in the absence of what's best. And I say it's not art, but a matter of experience, because it has no speech to give about the nature of things it makes use of or what it uses them on, whatever they may be, and therefore it can't state the cause of any of them. This is a very important statement, which he'll be expanding on quite a bit in this dialogue. But what is the basis of knowledge and art and really true power is what Socrates is getting at, because that's his original question. What's the power of rhetoric? We're going to see his answer is it isn't actually powerful. It appears powerful because you get people to do what you want, but so what? If you don't understand the nature of things, then you can't really have power in a true sense. Why is that? As we'll see, what makes something true, what makes it good and beautiful, is the accordance with nature. So just like with food, for example, the food that is most beneficial is not the food that tastes the best, but it's the food that is consistent with the nature of the body. So for example, what kind of nutrients does the body need to be healthy? That's the nature of the body, right? The way the body works. And if you understand the body and how it works, then you understand what kind of foods would be good for it and what would be harmful. But your taste buds don't necessarily tell you that, right? They can fool you on that. And the same thing with the soul, he's going to argue that if you understand the nature of the soul, and remember, that's why Tocqueville told us to read Plato, is to learn the nature of the soul, to actually be able to study the soul. If you learn the nature of the soul, then you're going to understand what's good for the soul and what actually benefits it, even if it doesn't feel good at first. But you know this is going to be good for your soul, as opposed to if you're just feeding your soul with whatever feels good at the moment, it's not actually going to be good for it. But how could you tell that difference if not based on feeling? It could only be based on knowledge, and knowledge of what? He says here, of the nature of the things, the nature of the body, the nature of the soul, the nature of the things that you put into the body and the soul, and how those things fit with the nature of the body or the soul. That is the thing that we need to be able to understand. We need to, just like when we're sick, we want to go to a real doctor who knows the human body. When we're training, we want to go to somebody who knows the body and knows how to perfect it. When we're asking about what's just or unjust, what's good or bad, We want to go to somebody who actually understands the human soul and who actually understands what is good or bad or just or unjust for human beings. And to know that, you have to understand the soul. I don't call any proceeding that's irrational an art, Socrates says. So this is what reason is for. And remember, reason and speech, this is the same word in Greek. So the art of speaking, the art of reasoning, has to be aimed at understanding the nature of things. If it isn't, then it's just babbling. And so that's Socrates' position. Again, initially, they're going to be flabbergasted by this. They're going to say, what are you talking about? Understanding the nature of things and so forth. Why do you want to do that? What's the point? But we can already see that, the basic answer, which is that, like, Socrates is saying, just like you wouldn't benefit yourself if you learn the art of cooking tasty food and you were so carried away that you just fed yourself all of your tasty food all the time. You're poisoning yourself, and your health is going to decline. You wouldn't be benefiting yourself with that so-called art, And he's implying it's the same thing with rhetoric. You're just spending your whole life talking about justice without knowing what it is. But justice is good for the soul, and injustice is bad for the soul if you understand the nature of it. So this is what Socrates is going to have to show them. He's going to have to show how justice is bad for the soul. Justice is good for the soul, and injustice is bad for the soul, in order to uphold this outline that he has given them at this point by Gorgias' request to explain his alternate point of view.